Hey folks, thanks for joining us. We're just going to give it about another minute and make sure we give everybody a chance to get in the door, and then we'll get started here. All right. I think we're about there. And we'll start off kind of slow here, make sure everybody can jump in. But thanks for being here. This is the Coastal Steelhead season planning meeting, town hall number 1. My name is James Losey. I'm the regional program manager for Region 6. I've got a lot of folks here, colleagues that have helped get us here today that I'll introduce. But first, just a couple opening thoughts. I wanted to just start by letting everybody know just how proud I am of all the work that's been done, by colleagues here on the line, huge fish program, staff at Fish and Wildlife, and then, of course, our tribal co-managers out here in the coastal region. We've got about 9 months of work, starting from time in the water to taking our waders off and getting the data in to today. And it's just been a tremendous workload. And also want to mention we got some new tools we've tried over the last year. All that information's in front of us. So just really proud of this team. And then I also, I don't think it would be right to not mention, we've been at these town halls for 3 or 4 years now. And we've got a growing group of folks that keep showing up to these meetings, and they're leaning into these challenges with us. And it's just been really helpful to see folks just show up and recognize the challenges we're facing and still help us carve out these fisheries. And I think tonight we're going to have some opportunity to see where we've, kind of benefited from that labor of this bigger team. So thanks for that. And then before I introduce everybody, the last kind of note I had was that we're going to have a lot of graphs and complex information, and just overall ton of information is going to be shared. There's a lot of new things happening. We've gone through a lot of change over the last few years, and so make sure we're all keeping up with it. So I want to make sure folks know we have an hour of presentation, about another hour to have conversation, and hopefully our main goal here is to hear some proposals from the public, some ideas about crafting fisheries. But if you feel like this 2 hours you didn't get your comment in, or there was a graph you didn't understand, that's okay. We've got about 3 weeks, maybe a little more, to get these fisheries figured out. So I encourage folks to reach out to everybody on this call. Everybody's got their phones on. And if there's something you didn't understand, just reach directly out to us and we'll make sure we're all on the same page. So let's jump in here and make sure we know who we got on the line, colleagues and friends of mine. Let's start with Kelly Cunningham, and I'll just have folks introduce themselves, and I'll just call you out.
Thanks, James. Hi, everybody. Kelly Cunningham. I'm the director of the fish program. Maybe just take a second and echo some of James's sentiments about those of you who've been engaged in this process over the last few years. It's greatly appreciated. The feedback has been extremely valuable. We're looking for some more of that tonight. So again, just thanks for sticking with us. For those of you who are here maybe for the first time, welcome. We're hoping for engagement from everybody. So don't be shy with your questions or your suggestions. We want to hear it. So thank you. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm going to just go down my list of little pictures here. So Jenny, why don't you go next?
Okay, thanks, James. I'm Jenny Whitney. I'm the WDFW district fish biologist for the North Coast and the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Thank you, everybody, for being
here. Amy?
Hi, I'm Amy Edwards, and I'm a stock assessment biologist for the region. So I kind of handle tasks that aren't limited to one basin or watershed, but can kind of dabble in a little bit of everything and kind of help with managing some of the creel surveys on the coast.
Thanks, Amy. Gabe?
Hey, good evening, everyone. I'm Gabe Madel. I'm the district fisheries biologist for South Puget Sound, so covering the Puyallup and the Nisqually for steelhead populations.
Thanks for being here, Gabe. Rob?
Hi, everybody. I'm the regional hatchery operations manager from Puyallup to Tumwater nacelle on a Pelwa.
Thanks, Rob. Bridget?
Hi, thanks everybody for being here. I'm Bridget Meir. I'm Coastal Region Communications Specialist.
Thanks. And Mike?
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. Mike Scharf. I'm District Fisheries Biologist for Queets, Quinault, and Grays Harbor Basin.
Great. And Leah?
Hi, I'm Leah Snyder. I am the admin assistant for Fish Program and the Zoom facilitator.
Thanks, Leah. I want to make sure I didn't skip a picture. It's a little clunky clicking through the boxes, so jump in if I missed you. But otherwise, want to remind folks that we've got a bunch of leads here in this coastal region, and then Gabe from Puget Sound, Public Affairs, but we've got this huge team of people from Science Division, Management, Hatcheries, all pitching in on this work. So we'll keep moving. And Leah, can you help me with this slide?
Yeah, so please note following for our webinar, as you enter, you're muted automatically, as you all have noticed by now. To ask a question, please raise your hand. If calling in, dial *9 or use the hand icon at the bottom of your screen if joining from a computer. When asked for questions and comments, unmute yourself using the mute button on your device or dialing *6 on your phone. If you have experienced technical issues during the webinar, please let us know in the chat and we will assist you. We ask that you treat everyone respectfully and avoid personal attacks, insults, or threats. Please discuss issues and questions rather than attacking the individuals or organizations. Offensive, disrespectful, or derogatory language, including profanity, is prohibited. Please limit the length and number of times you speak on each topic for a balanced discussion, and assume positive intentions from those speaking and listen respectfully. If you have any further comments or questions, please share them in written format online at our website, wdfw.wa.gov/coastal-steelhead. James.
Great. Thanks a lot, Leah. So we'll jump in here. So this is the preseason schedule. I highlighted in blue where we're at today. So this is town hall number 1. To get here, we have all that gray text that it's above. That's above that. It describes this process, of walking the spawning grounds, getting the data all in one place, exchanging that data with co-managers. And then we develop these preseason forecasts. They're finally agreed to just in time for this meeting. After we leave here, we're going to meet some more with our co-managers, start discussing with policy staff what management scenarios are most important to us, our anglers, the folks here on this call, and start discussing how we can make those match with our conservation objectives. And then the goal is everybody's fishing by December 1. So we'll have a November 27th town hall to discuss the results of the management plan development and communicate the director's decision on those agreed to plans. So in between a bunch of this gray text are other opportunities for public engagement through fish committee meetings and with the full commission. And so we have a little link down below that allows you to click on kind of a more comprehensive schedule. If you've got these slides printed out and you're looking at them, that web page down there is something to circle. You're going to see it throughout a bunch of slides, but everything we're trying to talk about tonight, if you got questions, click on that link. So this is our agenda for tonight. We're going to start, as we have in the past, make sure we're all on the same page with steelhead biology and stock assessment information, and just talk about, where our work intersects steelhead. And then we'll talk about the management framework, kind of these guiding principles for us in making decisions. We're going to review last season, some of the lessons learned, share information, and some raw data from last year. And then the final kind of main part of this work is to share the preliminary run size forecast. Once that's in front of everybody, we'll all be in I think a pretty good place to start talking about what type of fisheries we want. Maybe there's fisheries last season that you just loved and you really hope we can pull those off again next year. Or maybe there's some big idea. That's really what we want to hear, is what are the fisheries that are important to you that are going to fit within these conservation objectives. So that's our plan tonight. We'll start with the steelhead biology and stock assessment work. I want to highlight on the right that there's a map of Region 6. So this is the area that the folks on the line here are managing and the rest of our bigger team. We've got some Puget Sound and Hood Canal populations we'll talk a little bit about, but those are just really good reference points for us. We're going to focus on those rivers that you see on the coast, and we can talk about those kind of smaller tributaries in between if folks want, the ones that aren't labeled. So for this biology work, you know, steelhead are a lot like salmon in the sense they have this similar life cycle. They're anadromous. They use the freshwater in the marine environment. When we put the steelhead, you know, kind of arrows around this life cycle, we can see it's a little bit more complex. The most notable thing is there's this extra arrow. I'm assuming folks can see my cursor, but there's this extra arrow connecting this freshwater life cycle of a rainbow trout with steelhead. And that's because we know some proportion of the fish that leave the gravel that were spawned from steelhead will remain in freshwater their whole life. And then those fish will then rainbow trout will interact with adult steelhead when they return. So there's a lot of gene flow between rainbow trout and steelhead, and that's an important consideration for us managing the populations. If we look at where we're actually boots on the ground doing our work, how that shapes our conversation today, it's important for folks to recognize we release hatchery fish, hatchery smolts as juveniles, and then we enumerate both hatchery and wild fish in some cases in these smolt traps. That allows us to count juveniles as they head toward the marine environment, and we'll share some of that data with you. We also talk a lot about this period of time when steelhead first enter the marine environment. It's extremely critical. There's just on a normal year, there's high mortality at this phase. So it's a really great time to understand processes affecting steelhead. So this little map on the bottom right shows kind of this migration path of steelhead in the ocean. It's really just meant to demonstrate that steelhead are pelagic. They race across the ocean into the Gulf of Alaska, the coast of Japan, and they're surface oriented. And we know that from just really limited information. So we've been jumping into research with other folks, and we'll share some of that information about what we're learning, both about juvenile steelhead when they enter the marine environment, but then more tonight about these adult steelhead that have spawned, survived, and re-enter the marine environment. So we'll talk a lot more about those. Then this next set of figures is just kind of demonstrating what happens when steelhead return to the freshwater as mature adults. So this first graph here just shows some tribal catch data. We're going to zoom in on that graph later, but it's just demonstrating that we receive a massive amount of data from tribal co-managers that have these really high level, really precise sampling programs that allow us to understand how many steelhead are being caught, what their origin is, and most of our age data comes from this fishery sampling in tribal fisheries. The little picture on the top left is a catch record card image, and it shows that most of our catch information comes from catch record cards, but we know that's limited to hatchery origin fish that are harvested. To try to understand the encounters of wild fish, where we're mandatory catch and release, which is everywhere on the coast, we really rely on creel information. And so these creel programs are really limited in the coastal region, and they're limited mostly by finances, by funding. But we've done a lot of work in the recent years, kind of couch cushion exercises and some support from the legislature to try to ramp up this creel monitoring. And that's what that little picture is there. And why this is really important now is because we're going to show that steelhead abundance is really declining. So to implement a fishery, we need this really high precision around the fishery monitoring to make sure we're staying within those conservation concerns. And we need those now in a way we may not have needed that type of creel monitoring 20 or 30 years ago when steelhead were more abundant. So we'll share some of that, and it's exciting stuff. And then this last image here is this is kind of our bread and butter. This is red counts on the spawning ground. So we're counting steelhead nests. That's a picture of someone's knee kind of hanging from a helicopter, and that little shiny spot is a steelhead nest. or a red. And then I think I got one more here. We sample a lot of fish in the hatchery. So these are fish that return back, have moved through the fishery and return to their hatchery of origin. So that provides great data and information on these fish. We put a bunch of text all over this. So if folks want to, go home and do homework and learn more about all these things we're talking about, we're gonna show the spots throughout this presentation where you can go pull your own information, and all of that's going to be linked in the bottom right corner to that same web page I keep talking about. So feel free to click on that stuff if you can. The last thing I'll note on this is I added this word Celt to the smolt and Celt outmigration, because we're going to talk about these fish that survived this whole process and then in the spring move back out into the sea. So before I move on, just mention that this bottom right slide shows the ocean. We know the ocean's extremely important. So we're going to talk about both environments, the freshwater and the marine. But if we start with the marine environment, we really focus on this surface layer that we know steelhead are using. They're really surface-oriented, rapid migration out into parts of the ocean that have these sort of favorable marine conditions. This graph that you're looking at here is documenting changes in the ocean heat content. So the ocean's really good at storing heat. And Chang and other researchers have spent a lot of time documenting changes in this ocean heat content. And like I said, that really matters for steelhead. We know this is a part of the ocean they're using, and we know they have a pretty tight preference in the type of environment they like to live in, and it's cold. So we're paying a lot of attention to papers like this that document, these records in ocean temperatures, specifically in the surface layers. So in 2020, Chang and others published this paper documenting this record. A year later, they published another paper demonstrating that they beat their record. So we can see that this temperature is rising, and there's been a lot of questions about what this means for the future and steelhead. And so we can look to even more recent work from this group of researchers, and they provide kind of finer scale, higher resolution information on what to expect in the future and what we've seen in the past. So again, this is online. Folks can dig into it. And we encourage people, if they read this and there's aspects that they understand in a way we may not, reach out to us. We'd love to chat about this stuff. So that was all marine. We also know steelhead spend, 1 to 5 years in freshwater before they ever enter the marine environment. Freshwater environment is extremely important, specifically for this fish, steelhead. So we got to think about the freshwater when we're trying to predict what's to come. So we know if you hung out in the Pacific Northwest last summer, you saw that it was pretty dry. And in some cases, it was record-breaking in a lot of places. And in some places, there were these formal declarations of droughts. This middle article comes from the Idaho Capital Sun, so it's a little silly that it's for us to talk about here, but it's talking about Olympic Peninsula watersheds and these dry conditions. So if you're a steelhead and you rely on habitat and water, that's a big deal. Something folks also might have noticed this last summer is that we didn't see those high temperatures that we've seen coupled with the low flow conditions. So that's really good news. So us on this call, and it's kind of bigger in the agency and other partner groups, are trying to understand, if we get the drought, but we don't have the high temperature, is that, what does that mean? So we're kind of trying to disentangle those things. But we know it was dry, and that's not great if you're a steelhead. And then this last piece of this puzzle is these recent papers that try to help us disentangle that work. So these are steelhead specific research papers talking about changes in the broader and finer scale ecosystem and how that affects steelhead directly. So these are, if you're interested in this work, these are the papers to read. There's a lot more work too. And if you see something we're not sharing, please share it with us. So I'm moving fast through these, but I encourage folks to go back and look online. All these slides are there and you can pull this stuff, and these papers are there as well. So now if we just zoom in specifically on our coastal steelhead and our ecosystem here, we've got some tools that I want folks to know are things we're looking at when we think about the future for steelhead. So This figure here, there's a lot going on, but I think it's really important. This is one index of ocean conditions. It's called the North Pacific Gyre Oscillation. That's not important. We're going to call it the NPGO. What is important is that the NPGO and the ocean more broadly moves into these phases of, warm ocean conditions and cold ocean conditions. And the NPGO is really good at describing that. It relates to some of our freshwater environments, and it relates to ocean productivity and temperature. So what you can see on this graph is in the early part of the time series, we see these cold positive values of NPGO. So this is when the ocean's productive. And these are really, it's coupled with, high upwelling, cold sea surface temperatures. These are good conditions for a steelhead. In recent years, we've seen, negative values of the NPGO. So these are ocean conditions that are warm, unproductive, and often coupled with, really weak upwelling. So that recent value in pink represents measurements taken just this last spring, 2023, documenting some of the warmest ocean conditions and most negative values of NPGO we've seen in this short time series. We can take our steelhead survival on the coast and plot it right next to this and see how they're related. And that's what we're looking at here. So cold ocean conditions, we see high steelhead survival. And when the NPGO is red and ocean conditions are warm, we see low steelhead survival. The team here has taken most recent estimates of steelhead survival, you can see in pink, and plotted that. So as expected, we had low steelhead survival. You can see missing values in 2021, 2, and 3. That's important. So fish enter the ocean in 2021, 2, and 3, but not all of those fish have come back. We know steelhead are really complex. They enter the ocean, come back as 1, 2s, 3s, sometimes 4 years later. So we've got years ahead of us to figure out how steelhead performed in these poor ocean conditions. But why that gap is really important, that lag, is that we have some indication of what to expect for the long term. Looks like we're going to be weathering the storm for a while is the main point here. And so put a little bubble here just summarizing this, that steelhead survival is poor when ocean conditions are unfavorable, and we can measure that. And then future returns are expected to follow these extremely unfavorable ocean conditions, and in some cases, the worst we've seen. So as we get into our steelhead data from recent years, I want folks to think about this, that, worst ocean conditions we've seen in a while, pretty stable, poor conditions. Despite that, we have some rivers where we see performance is actually improving. So this is good news. So the ocean conditions are bad news, but we've made some moves here and we may be making some progress. So that's something I want us to consider. So that's all the steelhead biology. I know a lot of people knew some of that stuff, or maybe all of it, but I think it's important as we move forward. So now I'm going to talk about these management frameworks and some of the principles that we use, and then a review of last season. So there's a lot of words here. Folks have seen these, I think, before, but we have, specific considerations for steelhead we should be thinking about. We have limited in-season tools. We don't have a lot of dams in the coastal system that allow us to watch fish as they move through the system. We have effort shift uncertainty. If we close one system, we know steelheaders are not afraid to jump in a car and move to a different river. So we're trying to understand those effort shift uncertainties despite not having a bunch of sport fish monitoring or creel. We have uncertainty around forecast. You all will see that here when we show some rivers we hit right on the head in terms of predictions, and others were off. Good news is we're getting better and better every year at this work, so really proud of that. We have tribal co-managers. We have there's treaty rights out here in the coastal region, that we're legally bound by, and this isn't going to change. I do want to know that out in the coastal region, our tribal partners and our partners with the National Park Service are extremely powerful, and they help us get here today with really high quality data and information and really strong decision-making skills. So we really respect those relationships and appreciate them. And then we have escapement goals. These are our main targets, our conservation targets. We'll talk a lot about these goals. And then last couple things here, we have this protracted run timing. Steelhead, return from early December into late June in some cases, and in some cases they're returning all year round. And it's no accident that they do that. This protracted run timing, we know this life history diversity is extremely important for stabilizing these populations. And so we're going to make management decisions to make sure we protect that run timing with our fishing regulations. And then the last thing here is steelhead are currently not ESA listed in this coastal region we're talking about. There's a petition right now that NOAA is assessing, evaluating the risk associated with coastal steelhead, the extinction risk. The state and our tribal co-managers are helping to facilitate the data sharing for NOAA to do that work. But we still haven't heard a result of that listing petition. And so at this time, coastal steelhead are not ESA listed. So we'll be managing them consistent with the past few years. This key term slide is important. If you've printed this stuff out or haven't, you can go back and look at it. I'm going to use some of these words. I won't go through them all, but I encourage folks to look back at this slide if we say something that was confusing. And the only word I've really added since recent years is at the very bottom, we're going to talk about kelts. And these are those adult steelhead that are survived spawning, and they're making another go for it. So we'll talk about that. So this is the first sort of data slide. It talks about last year, and it really highlights the tools we have available for us that we use. So Creel last year was prioritized. We took, every penny we had focused on steelhead work, and we focused it on these Creel monitoring programs to secure fisheries, and also to learn about some of the data gaps that the public has highlighted for us. So we focused, I'm going to talk a lot about this Creel, so I'll just mention it quick here. We focused on the Hoe and the Quileute and parts of Willapa Bay. We did spawning ground surveys consistent with the past. No real major changes there. Hatchery rack returns were important for us to understand and how many fish were returning. Tribal fisheries data, as always, was extremely important. And then online season updates. So we had an online update tool. First time we'd done that. And we piloted this program so folks could track hatchery rack returns, our spawning ground work in certain index areas. And we got really good feedback for that. We're hoping to improve on that, do it again next year if the resources allow. So we can talk more about that if folks would like. And then digging in a little deeper, if people remember last year, we had these low forecasts in most rivers. We had conservative season regulations. We had bank fishing in Willapa and the Hoe watershed, and then boat fishing opportunity in some places, specifically the Quileute, main stem, parts of the Solduck, Kalawa, and Bogachiel. And then in season, we were monitoring these sport and tribal catch weekly in most cases, and it was suggesting we were right on track to have a regulation as we planned preseason. So that was good news in season. Looked like we were moving in the direction we were hoping we would. And then postseason, the preliminary estimates really suggested that assumption was right. We had high forecast accuracy and some places where the run size exceeded those preseason expectations. And so you'll see those specific numbers. And then in places where we have restrictions to protect wild steelhead, you can imagine that also lowers catch rates on hatchery. I think folks are well aware of that. Trying to use these hatchery fish where we can. We'd rather them get caught in our freshwater fisheries as intended, but where they weren't, we planted those in lakes. And we had a pretty cool program, well advertised this past year. And we're proud of the fact that fish that were about to be surplused in many cases found themselves in a lake and were harvested by a different group of anglers catching steelhead in those freshwater systems. So that was a good program. And if we need to, we'll use that again. So a lot of people on this call, I expect, are interested in our Creel estimates, and there's a whole bunch of background information that I think supports that interest. So I wanted to make sure people had the actual data available to them. I'm not going to read every one of these values, I just want to make sure folks are familiar with where we did this intensive, comprehensive creel, and what are some of the key things we got out of it. So with the limited funding we had, we focused on places where we had the biggest kind of question marks around the encounters of wild steelhead. And so that included 2 systems in Willapa River and the Naysell River, that's Willapa Bay. We focused work on the hoe consistent with the past, but increased the complexity of that work and precision. So the toolkit got bigger, even though the amount of money and resources didn't. We brought in the best available science to try to get the best estimates there in the hoe. And then almost every year when the hoe is out and it's not fishable, we get this overlap into the Quileute where we can send folks to do these kind of spot checks of the fishery and interview some people in the Quileute. We decided to focus that kind of overflow into a more focused, comprehensive creel in the sole duck. So just one part of the Quileute system. And we got some great data out of there. And then we also added this extra layer as a pilot project. Lots of new things we're adding and learning about. One of them was this test fishery. So bring in Fish and Wildlife employees, technicians for a couple months and learn about the fishery firsthand. So test different gear types, sample scales on fish, and learn about how that fishery is performing with Fish and Wildlife employees. So learned a lot about that. There's a few of the edges we're going to polish on that work, but it's going to be really important in even tighter spots like the Chehalis where we want to design some fisheries. So all that said around creel, the thing I really want to highlight, and folks should read some of this on their own or we can circle back, the last percentage that you see under each one of these. So like for Willapa Bay, you can see Willapa River, and there's this 20% of the run caught. So that's our encounter rate on wild steelhead in the Willapa River. So in the Willapa, 20% of the wild steelhead that entered the system are estimated to have been caught. In the Naysell, 21% of the run. In the hoe, we had an 86% encounter rate estimated. And so to remind folks, that's a fishery that was no fishing out of a boat and closed at the end of March. So during that period of time, 86% of the run was caught. And then in the sole duck, we had a 55% encounter rate. Want to remind folks too, the sole duck 55% encounter rate is it's a low estimate if you consider the fact that sole duck fish caught in other places of the Quileute watershed, like the main stem that were bound for the Sole Duck River, were not part of that estimate. So this is sole duck fish in the Sole Duck River. So, but extremely important information, and we're building on this and comparing it to past years of data to try to refine these estimate of encounters in just these few watersheds. So then naturally, we share the fisheries with our co-managers and the allocation of the resource. And so there's questions about how many fish did our tribal co-managers catch? That's what this table is showing. The first column is the projected estimate of wild steelhead based on our agreed to fishing plans or just expectations communicated pre-season. In the right column, that's what was actually harvested based on fish ticket data and scale samples and communication with the tribe. So what you can see from this figure is that in Willapa, Chehalis, and Hump Tulips, 0 wild steelhead were caught. That was the expectation. Same for the sport fishery. In the Quinault, Queets, Hoe, and Quileute, the next 4 down, you could see that the wild harvest was significantly lower than was projected pre-season. I want to make sure folks are really clear that left column is not a quota. It's not a limit or the number of fish the tribe is, sort of restricted to. These are their fisheries, they're managing them. And in all of these cases, they're managing them for a harvest rate. So when the run comes in, there's an expected harvest rate, and those wild projected numbers are what would have been expected to be caught. And I think that's important. But the main point of this slide is that the tribal catch overall was 40% of what was projected pre-season. And that's a result of management actions and lower than expected effort. So this is really a conservation concern shared by the state and the tribe, these wild abundance levels. And we see that in everyone's catch. Everyone's pulling back, the state and the tribe. and trying to get these fish on the spawning grounds. So the next piece of information, I want to dig into the statewide steelhead management plan, the major guiding principles behind our steelhead management out here on the coast and statewide. So just briefly, the statewide steelhead management plan describes these 4 VSP parameters, these kind of 4 targets that we're supposed to consider, or we will consider, when designing fisheries. And when the public here, our constituents and partners and colleagues, when we're all thinking about the type of fisheries that we want to implement, we need to be thinking about these 4 VSP parameters. The one we're all most comfortable talking about, the parameter we're most comfortable talking about is the abundance parameter. Of course, this is the number of wild steelhead. It's the easiest one for us to measure. It's the easiest one for us to score or characterize when we're evaluating our fisheries, but we're also going to talk about these other 3 just briefly. So for abundance, the statewide steelhead management plan has specific targets, and this is really important for those folks thinking about the fishery they want. When we have a run size that's expected to come in above the goal, so we have a really big forecast, we're going to come way above the goal. The plan is to assure the escapement goals are met. So design fisheries to ensure we meet those goals. But there's also scenarios you'll see tonight where we have forecasts expected to come in below the goal. Before anyone goes fishing, when we're here at the town hall, we're going to have low run sizes. In that case, we're going to minimize the mortality of wild stocks, and we're not going to exceed a 10% impact. So this is really designed so we can target those late salmon fisheries in December, so we can target hatchery fish, and know we're going to have an impact on wild steelhead. But in some case, there might be a wild steelhead targeted fishery that has a soft touch, let's say, and is going to keep those impacts to less than 10%. The little graph here I'm going to zoom in on, but it's the Chehalis River, and it's describing how we look at this abundance value. So I'm going to zoom in on that graph now. So this is the same graph, but we're going to step through this first one slowly. So there's an arrow pointing to where the Chehalis is, the little bubble. And then on the x-axis here, the horizontal axis, you can see return year. And on the vertical axis, we see the number of steelhead. And what this graph is showing is the number of steelhead that have returned, over the last about 40 years in the Chehalis River. So this is the total run size. The line that slopes down, that's the trend in run size over the time period. And the little red dot is the most recent value. So this is last year's run size. So essentially, we're adding up escapement and harvest and released mortality, and we're coming up with an estimate of total fish that enter the river. We can also plot the escapement, the number of fish that made it to the spawning grounds, and that's always going to be underneath the run size. And then the last thing to point out here is the horizontal line that cuts right through this graph. That's our escapement goal. So if the dark line is below that horizontal line, it means we did not meet our escapement goal. And you can see in the Chehalis, the run size is declining, and we have a history of not meeting that escapement goal, numerous years. So that's how this graph works. And I'm going to move through all these populations you see on the coast much more rapidly and show you how these trends line up. And I want folks to focus on the trend, but also that red dot, and that's the most recent value. And in most graphs, there's 2 red dots because there's an escapement and a run size. But because we didn't harvest in the Chehalis, those 2 dots are right on top of each other. They're the same number. So here we're looking at Willapa Bay. You can see a shorter time series that we've been doing this work, but you can see similar declining trend. But this recent year, we met our escapement. That's the second time in the last 20 years we've met escapement in Willapa Bay. So that was exciting. Here we're looking at the hump tulips. Significant decline in the run size. Again, you can see the escapement, their run size for the last 3 years. Those lines are right on top of each other, and that's due to limited or zero harvest in the last 3 years. But ultimately not meeting our escapement, but kind of stable run size there in the last few years. Quinault has a lot of lines, Quinault River. The reason for this is the upper Quinault is the area we manage. Everything below Lake Quinault is is reservation, Quinault Indian Reservation. So we don't fish that area. So what we've done here is the dark black line shows just the upper Quinault escapement. And you can see it's below this escapement goal, WDFW escapement goal, but overall relatively stable during the time series. And then the gray line above it represents the run size of the upper Quinault run. If you look at this top line, this is the total Quinault River run size, and you can see a steady decline through time. If we move to the Queets, real similar story, decline through time, but a slight increase in recent years and getting extremely close to meeting that escapement goal. You can see extremely limited harvest from our tribal co-managers on this one and no harvest from the state in the Queets River that last season. Here, the Ho has a little bit different story. We have the same decline we've been seeing, very similar, but we've got a history of meeting the escapement goal here. And I think that here we can see kind of reveal some of the benefits of that, despite really poor ocean productivity, environmental conditions. We've got a strong history of meeting the escapement goal. We've got an increasing run size. And I should also mention a lot of important work there, improving habitat by our tribal co-managers, coastal partners and nonprofits, you know, and of course, Fish and Wildlife. So really cool story in the Ho River. It feels like even in the toughest times for a steelhead, we're making some progress here. And then a quite similar story in the Quileute, consistently meeting our escapement goal or coming very close to it. Really stable population size in the recent year, declining overall, but it looks like we're weathering the storm right now if you just look at the last 4 or 5 years. And then I want to just zoom in, like kind of flip over to the Puget Sound real quick because it's a good reference point. This is the Nisqually River. You can see we're not really making progress here in terms of abundance, despite the lack of fishing in this area. So wanted to share that. And then a similar story in the Puyallup River. So it's good for us to keep in mind, I think, and that's why we share them here. So then this last abundance graph for run size, we stacked all these run sizes on top of each other, kind of stacked them up, and we get a total run size for the coastal region for wild steelhead. You can see it's a shorter time series because we're just using the available data where we've, got information from all systems. But overall, this is a great way to observe that increased run size, this kind of subtle increase we saw this last season. So to look at these data, like actually kind of share the numbers, you can see in this first column, similar table, but now I'm showing on the first column a predicted run size. And then right next to it is the actual run size that we observed. So we have places like Willapa where we predicted 3,500 fish and we actually under predicted. We saw 4,900. We also have places like the Chehalis where we over predicted 7,114 fish. And we saw estimated 6,249. And then if you go all the way to the bottom to the Quileute, tribal co-managers in the state are really proud of this one, almost hit it right on the head with the predicted run size and the actual run size. So, kind of variable forecast success on these, but lessons learned in some places that will improve forecasts here that we're going to show next. If we compare that with our escapement goals and then last year's actual escapement, I highlighted in gray places where we did not meet our escapement goal. So there's 4 systems, Chehalis, Hump Tulips, Upper Quinault, and Queets Clearwater that we did not meet escapement goals. Overall, what this tells us is that we forecasted within 3% of the actual run size. It's pretty darn good. I think folks on this call should be proud of that number. And then escapement goals were met in 3 of the 7 rivers. Highlight here that Willapa Bay met its escapement goal for only the second time in 20 years. So again, we got a couple of these spots. I think, we can kind of see the benefit of this hard work we've been up to. So that was all about abundance. I'm going to move through the productivity, distribution, and diversity much quicker, not because it's less important, because, you know, our tools are less refined in these areas. But for productivity, we can look at this lots of ways. But I think the most quantitative way is through smolt abundance. So fish spawn, they dig redds, they put their eggs in the gravel. What comes out of those redds is really important. And if those smolt survive, we want to know it. And so Science Division, Marisa Litz leads this work for Fish and Wildlife, does a fantastic job. This is a long time series here, and she shared with us most recent values. You can see we're just below the average smolt abundance, but this allows us to have our finger on the pulse with, you know, how are these red counts that we're estimating resulting in juveniles going out to sea. So we have a number of smolt traps, not a lot, but a few places where we can monitor this smolt abundance. And this I think is probably one of our best data sets. In terms of distribution and diversity, this is a picture of the Chehalis River, just highlighting that steelhead spawn in lots of places in the Chehalis. And if you walk the stream in one system, you'll learn pretty quickly that steelhead are spawning at different times in each different system, and each one is characterized by its kind of own special time and steelhead. So a lot of variability in time and place here, just highlighting that in the figure. We can measure that as well. And the way we've done it the past few years is shown those escapement levels for each year and broken those up by specific tributaries. So if we do that for the Chehalis system, this graph gets a little wild, but it's the same data you already saw. It's the total number of fish that spawned in the Chehalis River for each year. Goes up and down. You can see the height of that bar. But now we've filled in the bar with the proportional contribution of all these different tributaries. So where did these fish actually spawn in the Chehalis is the question we're answering here. And what you can see in an ideal situation is we have lots of colors. Steelhead are spawning in many different places in the Chehalis, and we want to keep it that way. We can measure this diversity, get a scorecard for how we did each year through a variety of indices, but one that's really common is this Shannon diversity index. So if we calculate it for each year, we can see diversity really goes up and down. Some years, they're really distributed in lots of places, and other years we see some rivers perform well and some do poor. So while Chehalis escapement has been stable, we saw in this past year that diversity went down. So that means some of these small tributaries didn't perform well, and some of the big tributaries, you can just see in the colors, become a really big component of that total escapement. So this allows us to zero in on specific places and make sure we're protecting all of these populations in the way they should be. A lot of folks are interested in this data across the board. We can do it lots of places, but just for the sake of time, I did it in a couple, or we as a team did it in a couple places. Here's the Quileute River. This one I know is on a lot of people's mind. We've got a number of tributaries here, populations that are unique in the Quileute River. If you look at this, you see the same variability, ups and downs, but we see a diversity increase in the most recent year. That's our last little dot here on the bottom right. That increase in diversity is due in large part to an increase in spawners in the Bogashiel. So that's the black bar. And you can see, you know, the actual escapement has been relatively stable, but we see the black has become a bigger component of the total escapement. And that's good news. And then the last one I'll show here, this is Willapa Bay. I got something blocking my screen here, so I'm trying to move it. So stick with me here. And we can see a similar story where, you know, we've got pretty good diversity across the system. But in the most recent year, I think this is intriguing. We are happy with the Willapa escapement, but we see this diversity has declined. So this allows us to look specifically at places where we know steelhead spawn, like the Palex in yellow, and say, yeah, steelhead overall looks good, but we want to make sure we're protecting all of these populations. So there's probably a little bit of work or a finer look we could do at places, you know, like the Palex or North River, which the bottom cranberry colored segment. So That's how we're looking at these populations, but overall we feel good about this diversity. Couple other notes here on this topic. So this little graph on the right represents tribal catch data, and it shows us, a lot. It kind of demonstrates the difference in run timing for early run hatchery and also wild fish. So we can see that in many systems, these early hatchery origin fish come in early, and that's really great if we're trying to design fisheries to just target those, and then the wild come late. But we just want to flag for everybody designing proposals and helping us think about fisheries that if we focus our efforts during this early hatchery component, we've got a large proportion of the wild run that will also be encountered. So we're thinking about ways to target these hatchery fish, but not front load all of our impacts, just to make sure we're providing adequate protection for the entire population. And then the last piece about diversity, I'm really excited to share this information. Our team's worked hard on it. This graph we showed a couple years ago, that's updated now, but it just shows the rate of iteroparity, the rate of repeat spawners, we should say, over time in 4 of these systems. And all we need to kind of recognize here for this graph is that these repeat spawners, they're big, they're highly fecund, they have lots of eggs, they dig deep reds, they have bigger eggs. We know they're important for productivity. So we want these repeat spawners in our population. They're important. But we've noticed, and others across the range of steelhead have noticed, a decline in repeat spawners. And this is a problem. We also know that they're just variable. We have years where we have lots of repeat spawners and years where we don't have many. So a lot of folks in the agency here and more broadly have been designing experiments and looking through data to try to understand why this might be. Here in Region 6, we directly explored this through a tagging study, and I think it's important for us to be thinking about when we're talking about fisheries. So I just want to mention briefly what we were looking at here. So here we're looking at a map of the coastal range, and we put a box around Willapa Bay. And then we have pictures of a tagging study that we conducted a couple years ago. So overall, how this went is we intercepted hatchery and wild fish at Forks Creek Hatchery. We tagged 86 steelhead with acoustic tags. This was done, like I mentioned, at Forks Creek. We had 37 hatchery fish, 49 wild tagged. For the hatchery fish, we live spawned them, tagged them, held them in the hatchery for about a week, and then released them downstream and watched where they went. For the wild fish, we captured them, tagged them, and released them back upstream so they could be on their way. Some of those fish, you can imagine, spawned and then survived the spawning event, and that's when the tracking got interesting, when they went downstream as kelts. So all the open circles on this map represent receivers that are listening for these tagged fish, so we can hear them as they move through the environment. These are partner receivers from Canada all the way down to California. Folks are supporting work like this. So we piggybacked on it through steelhead license plate dollars to get some tags in our steelhead and understand kelp movements. What you can see from this map just briefly is there's these open circles, and then the ones that are filled is where we heard steelhead moving through the environment. The main point here is that steelhead moved offshore rapidly as adult kelts. That's consistent with how juveniles move in the environment. And it's important, I think it was an interesting finding that we didn't detect them on the continental shelf here on the OP. We didn't detect them south by the Columbia River. They moved directly offshore. And we can kind of zoom in on that map here and see that more closely, that one fish moved into South Willapa Bay for about 5 minutes. But other than that, the movement was very direct and offshore. But what we were extremely interested in is the freshwater environment. We wanted to know, is there a predator hotspot we should be thinking about? Is there a delayed migration at some point that may be affecting survival? So we compared the survivors and the ones that didn't make it to sea for these kelts. And we tried to understand, what are the survivors doing different? So if we zoom in on those survivors, we can just build some graphs that show where they spent their time and when that was. So that's what we're looking at here in the bottom left. This is residence time in these different habitat segments. And so here on the left, you can see spawning grounds moving to the upper river. And then we have the lower river. We've colored orange here to just demonstrate it's a big component. And then the bay. And what you could see is the residence time in the bay was less than 5 days. That was really consistent among all these survivors. But the lower river was extremely important place for these fish to hang out. We saw an average of about 23 days in the lower river for these kelts, but many over a month spent time in this area. And most of these movements in these areas were occurring in March and April, as you can see on the right graph. And then being someone just interested in fish behavior, we were interested, is this a daytime movement, a nighttime movement? So we built this little clock, and one of our colleagues, Toby Harbison, that's not with us, is just great at analyzing data like these. And she built this little clock that shows when this movement was happening. So it was happening in the late hours of the night and early hours of the morning, almost exclusively. So what this means for us, why we're talking and thinking about it, is because it tells us that surviving kelts move slowly in the lower river in March and April, holding during the day, and then migrated rapidly offshore. This information is going to be important for us to think about how we design fisheries and think about these fish. And we're using tools like this in other areas too to gain more insight. So there's a lot of words here, but I'm keeping track of the time. So I'm gonna zip through this, but this is kind of the summary of everything we talked about. And I think some of the key points here are that escapement goals were met in some of the watersheds, but not all. And then I think it's important to note that there's this long-term decline of steelhead abundance still, but we're seeing this recent 4 or 5 years either stabilize or in some places increase as we kind of, like I say, weather that storm. So this last piece, I think this is why a lot of people are here, is to understand what do we got to expect for next year. So this is the forecast table for the upcoming season. These are the expectations for fish coming back. These are preliminary numbers, but these are extremely close to the final number, if not exact. So we don't expect these numbers to change. These are the numbers that are going to help us design these fisheries. And what you can see, we have some places where expectations are that steelhead will come in higher, some places where they'll come in lower. And then I've added this wild steelhead relative to the goal and highlighted places in gray where the steelhead numbers are expected to come in less than the escapement goal. So we'll be managing to a 10% release mortality, or excuse me, a 10% mortality, 10% impact rate, I should say. And then other places like the Quileutes, an easy one to do the math, where we have 3,196 fish over the goal to design fisheries. So we divide that in half for treaty allocation, and then we look at half of that number, 3,196, to design fisheries. So the idea is in no case do we want to exceed this 1,598 in the Quileute. So that's an example there. So the last slide I really want to show on this is there's places like the Chehalis where people are looking at this number 214, and we can talk about that math and how we get there. But this is the number we have to design fisheries, sport fisheries in the Chehalis. And there's folks asking us how we use those 214 fish to design a fishery. Can we creel the heck out of it and monitor it with high precision and get something specifically below hatcheries? So none of that modeling work has been done, but I do want to share how that could work, because Mike Scharf and his team have been thinking extremely hard about how to get a fishery in the Chehalis that still supports, the rebuilding of these populations. So 214 fish broken out by system because we want to protect this diversity across the watersheds. We can generate these impact limits by river. And this is done in the Chehalis. We could do this in other places too, this type of math. But then the question becomes, if we look at a place like the Satsop River, where we have a 62 sport impact limit, that's 62 dead wild steelhead for the whole season, how would we design a regulation and a monitoring program that would ensure we would not limit, or we would not exceed 62 dead wild steelhead? So the way we're thinking about this, to protect run timing diversity, protect all these tributaries, is to add these different, or to break these 62 fish up and their sats up by their expected run timing. So one idea I want to make sure folks hear today, and we can discuss it and I spend the next few weeks discussing it, is how would we design fisheries where we could limit our impacts by month in these systems and carve out the fisheries that are most important to us with the, I'll just say, extremely limited sport monitoring resources we have, knowing that the hoe is still extremely important, the Quileute, there's other fisheries, upper Quinault, that we want to talk about. But if we were to pick a fishery or two in the Chehalis and try to design a monitoring program, how would we do it? And how would we ensure that we don't exceed these impact limits? And then, of course, hatchery steelhead are important. I want to share with folks that forecasts are slightly lower than last season, but they're not going to limit fisheries. The hatchery forecasts are not. We have available hatchery fish to harvest, and that's the intention, is to design fisheries to provide that opportunity. So I'm going to move quickly through this, but I really encourage folks to print this off and look at it or call us. So this is my last slide, and then we can chat as a group. So I want to make sure folks understand what's, sort of what decision making or what proposals will lead to decisions that allow us to go fishing. So what's the framework for making these decisions? If you look at the top of this graph, this is really pulled from the statewide steelhead management plan. We built this to try to give us this, thing we could stick on the wall and start talking about these fisheries. So in the top is these different scenarios I've shared tonight, that we have some rivers that are forecasted above escapement. We can think about a place like the Quileute River. In that scenario, we're going to design fisheries to meet or exceed the escapement goal with our tribal co-managers and look for agreement there. And these fisheries can be diverse. In places where the forecast is below the escapement goal, like Willapa Bay, we need to design fisheries where in no case we will exceed 10%. And we're going to be confident in those decisions. We're not going to exceed 10%. And so this could be diverse regulations. Maybe we reduce seasons or gear restrictions. And then we're going to have places in red here where it's just too tight. The forecast is significantly below escapement. We don't have the monitoring resources to design these high precision fisheries to keep it below 10%. And so this is kind of our framework, is if we can shift through monitoring some of these red into the yellow, because we can put a bunch of monitoring on it, then we're going to do our best. Otherwise, these ones that are in green is where we'll be spending a lot of time thinking about fisheries. So you could take your table here and start thinking about how we would put these different rivers into different boxes. So the last thing I'll say, and then I'm going to take a moment here to hear what folks have to say. We're excited to hear whatever people are thinking. That's what we're here for. But we're short on time. We really want to hear proposals for fisheries. That's what we want to hear most. Any questions about what was presented would be helpful. And then this first bullet that's on here, we didn't have time in the slide deck to talk about this, but we've used this no fishing out of a boat regulation for a number of years on the coast. And I think it's been really powerful for us to achieve our conservation objectives. That said, we have some people that are telling us we should apply this coastwide for maximum protection. But there's uncertainty about whether that's necessary or how much protection that will give wild steelhead. We have other folks that are telling us that there's no savings associated with no fishing out of a boat regulation. So we have estimates of savings associated with the regulation, but they are not precise. And we're doing our best to understand what that is. But when we bring the team together, we look at past year's data and past creel efforts, the precision isn't increased that much. So for folks that have been asking us, to test this no fishing out of a boat regulation and really understand how much savings there is, we want some ideas. We want to know what people think about ways we could test that, use our resources, use our test fishers. Maybe there's constituents in the guide community or others that have ideas on how we could test this regulation. So we're thinking of ideas, and we want to know what people think about that rule, specifically how we would test it. Okay, I'm going to take a pause and Leah, can I ask you to help me take over with questions?
You've got it. So our first hand is Andy. Andy, go ahead. You should be able to unmute yourself. I think I've just sent you a prompt also.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
All right, sorry about that. My question, and it's more of a concern, has to do with the Chehalis and the Willapa fisheries. Those are the areas I spend most of my time, and obviously it was just on the Willapa fisheries this last year, and it was the most crowded I've ever seen it. And you'd find, years past, you'd see a few people from Oregon in those areas fishing, maybe somewhere else, but there were license plates from all over the West. And when I get a chance to chat those folks up, they were down there because the South Olympic rivers and the lower Chehalis tributaries were closed down. Specifically, the Wainuchi and the Queets are the ones that would pop up. And while I'm pleased to see in your numbers that the Willapa is doing well, like individually, those rivers, at least how I interpret it on your graphs there, like maximum maybe 1,000 fish per river, upper hundreds on some of the other better ones. So it seems that we're funneling rivers from fish that even with their lower numbers still have fish in the, mid, 1,500s up to a couple of thousand into rivers that have fish in the hundreds. So I'd like to see, some kind of a Chehalis and lower coast fisheries there to just kind of relieve pressure from those smaller rivers. Maybe specifically the Satsip, because it looks like it's doing well. The Wainuchi earlier in the season, maybe into February for the hatchery fish, and continue the no fishing from a boat, because I really do think that makes a difference on those smaller rivers there in the Chehalis and the Willapa, because there's any number of times I can see fish that I can't get at when I'm floating or hiking around. But that's the gist of what I got. Just want to make a comment on my concerns about the higher pressures on those rivers with smaller runs. Thank you.
Hey, Andy, thanks. I appreciate your comments and thanks for getting specific. Mike and I are here taking notes on the specifics that you mentioned for the Chehalis. So yeah, I really appreciate it. Thanks for the feedback.
And we had quite a few questions in the chat, so I'm going to go every other prompting, maybe hopefully getting some people to ask their questions live. Somebody that had a few questions and comments in the chat is Mac. Mac, if you would like a chance to ask your questions live, I have just sent you a prompt.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, just love all the data. I'm a data person, so I love that. I'm sitting here with my son, who's a big fisherman too, and we fished the Sky Comet a bunch, and I've always wanted to see some steelhead there. Didn't hear anything about it. I assume that's because there's just so few. Is that right?
I'm sorry, say the name of the river again.
Sky Comish, the north-south fork Sky Comish, just below that. I know there's a hatchery there.
Yeah, just focused on coastal right now, but
got it. Okay,
but it's on our mind, not mine here in Region 6. But yeah, the state's thinking about it. So thanks for feedback on that. But yeah, and thanks for the positive feedback on the data too.
Oh yeah, and one other question, about how to measure. Do you guys have any information on what you have, researched and thought about? I mean, I know there's such limited budget and things like Creole is fairly easy to do. But one of my concerns and my questions was how confident are we in the creel data, given sort of anglers' apprehension to give maybe the actual numbers of what they're catching. I know there's not much we could do about that, but I'm just curious how you guys deal with that.
Yeah, so we got a bunch of creel experts on the line here, so they'll correct me if I say anything wrong, but there's a lot of uncertainty around our estimates in creel. I reported some numbers here, but what I didn't report is the error bars around that. So if we say 86% of the steelhead were caught, plus or minus 20% isn't uncommon. So one way we get around it is more creelers. So folks like Amy here on the phone can design a creel study plan that increases precision by adding additional what we call tie-ins, where we fly the river and count the number of people. And then we also have really great relationships with some guides in these systems. And so you get these sort of qualitative feeling on anglers are lying to us or they're not, and tribal catch data and hatchery. So you aggregate all these pieces and you can kind of tighten those estimates. The other thing, so number one, I mean, I should just say, not kind of tighten them, they're becoming extremely tight and precise. So the sophistication around our creel work is really impressive if we've got the resources. The last piece is we've explored this a lot. Do we bring so the liar effect, because if we tell anglers your fishery is limited by the number of fish you catch, so if you catch too many, you're going to get closed down, there is incentive to lie to us. We also know, though, some people like to brag and overestimate. So how do we estimate that? We don't have a perfect answer, but we do have this interest in hanging out with our anglers more often directly. And so ideas like test fishers, partnerships with the people that catch the most fish, things like that help us get at it. But interested in any ideas you think of over the next, long time as we got here to think about it. So yeah, reach out.
Yeah, a lot of social engineering along with data engineering, right? Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It's like you're on mute, Leah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I had a weird connection issue for a second. That's over now. Our next hand is from Ed. Ed, go ahead.
Hello. I had two questions which I put into chat. The first one is going back to the escapement goals on your first set of river graphs. It seemed like the escapement goal remained constant over the years of the graph. Was the escapement goal the same over that time period? Or which specific escapement goal did you use?
Yeah, that's a great question. Appreciate it. So what Ed's referring to here is the horizontal line across the graph. This is the Quileute River, just for example. So the escapement goal is static. We have a number of spawners that we use as an escapement target. And the goal here is to maximize the probability of fully seeding the spawning grounds. So what we know is if we meet that escapement goal in every single year, we meet or exceed the number of spawners in every single year, it's above that line, there's a high probability the spawning grounds is fully seeded. But Ed, you make a really good point that we won't dig into too deep here, but biologically, the escapement is not the perfect escapement that we say spawners at MSY. Like, it is not static in time, because we know some years the river is really low during spawning and maybe not as many fish can fit in it. So we would, maybe we would meet maximum spawner at MSY in a spring where flows were low. But then there's also risk. We have some years where we could support a lot more fish than you see in that horizontal line, and we would be limiting ourselves for long-term success if we lived up to that escapement goal. So I want folks on this call to know all the horizontal lines that you see on all these graphs, these escapement goals, represent about a 85% probability that we're successfully meeting a biologically relevant escapement. So there's some risk involved in these goals, but we've seen in places like the Quileute and the Hoe, here's the Hoe, that if we consistently meet these goals, we're learning today that we're supporting stable or rebuilding populations during some of the worst conditions. So these are good goals, but like you mentioned, they're not perfect.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but during the meetings with the co-managers, isn't deciding on the escapement goal for a particular river system in a particular year oftentimes a point of negotiation?
In only 2 systems right now on the coast are we in a development phase for escapement goals, and that's
Okay.
in Queets and Quinault. But for the others, we have co-manager agreements that are not annual. You know, they're long-term agreements, and if we wanted to change those, we'd have lengthy discussions about what would be more appropriate. So you'll see these escapement goals in the past work and likely into the future.
Thank you for clarifying that. May I ask one other question?
Yeah, I think so, as long as we got time for others too.
All right. Specifically, let's talk about the Skookumchuck for a moment. A river within a much greater ecosystem, the Chehalis, but the run size on the run on the Skookumchuck is primarily a hatchery run. But last year anyway, the Skookumchuck got lumped in with the overall Chehalis Basin Plan. Is there a way that you can craft a specific regulation on rivers, and the Skookumchuck is one of a few like this, where the hatchery component is significantly large and would allow anglers to fish on that hatchery run and potentially remove some pressure from other streams?
Yeah, so great question. So Mike Sharp's been staying up really late working on this one, and Skookumchuck is one of those target areas that we've heard, you know, consistently from anglers that they want to go fishing. We don't want those hatchery fish on the spawning grounds. We would like folks to remove them. The thing here, as you can see in this table, is we've got a sport impact limit of 9 wild steelhead in the Skookumchuck for the whole season. With a 10% release mortality, we would say that's 90 fish maximum captured, knowing that about 10% of them would die. So if we designed a sport monitoring program that could ensure that we would capture less than 90 steelhead, wild steelhead during the season, and we have the resources to monitor that, we want to do it. The risk is, I want to be open and honest with folks, if you look at this graph, and in December, it's 0.5 dead steelhead. So we could capture 5 wild steelhead in December if you do the math with the 10% release mortality. We could put a fishery in December, get a week into it, find out we just caught 9 wild steelhead, and we would have to make a change to that regulation. So if we did design a fishery in the Skookumchuck or one of these other systems that's important to people, we would want a regulation that we have high confidence that we're not going to exceed these limits. We would want to create a fishery that's stable. We don't want to shut a fishery down or even change the regulation in season. And then we would want to have the resources to monitor it, because otherwise, you know, it's a co-manager agreement and we need to defend a fishery if we think it's responsible. So a lot of pieces, we're working on it, but we want to know if we move down this path, which ones of these in the table here are highest priority. And I'm hearing you say Skookumchuck. So thanks for all your comments, Ed.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Mike, you know, I'll just give you a chance here, Mike. I'm doing a lot of talking. Did I miss anything there?
No, you're doing just fine.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Mike.
Our next question, I'm going to pull from the chat. Brian, you asked some questions there. I was going to give you a chance to ask them live.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I'll submit written comments, and I'm going to ask you a question that's not necessarily from my question in the chat, but last year, there was an opportunity, as I recall, for fisheries, by the numbers you presented anyway, in the Upper Quinault and in the Queets. But if I recall correctly, at one of the last town halls, Mr. Cunningham reported back that there wasn't an agreement with the, I believe it was with the Quinault Indian Nation. And therefore, the Department of Fish and Wildlife decided to not have any recreational fisheries open in those two watersheds that have been historically pretty important for recreational anglers. So what actions have you taken in the last year or 9 months or so to work with the Quinault Indian Nation to not have a repeat of what happened last year?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. A lot of hard work and a lot of conversations. So relationships with our co-managers are like a lot of relationships, that we need a common understanding of each other's principles. And if we're gonna move into a fishery together, it's a partnership. So what we saw last year was numerous proposals from the Quinault Indian Nation that we were uncomfortable with, specifically the level of harvest planned. So when we sign a co-manager agreement to go fishing, we're part of that plan. And so we're holding sport anglers accountable for, really, conservation principles that we feel strongly about. And so when we have agreed to fisheries, we're going to make sure they're consistent with that. So we didn't get that agreement with the Quinault and Queets rivers. In the Chehalis and Hump Tulips, those conversations were hard, but we did get agreement. But again, Brian, we were thinking we might be fishing below hatchery racks in the Skookumchuck and the Wainuchi, and we didn't get there. So these are hard conversations. We got, some wins in terms of the conservation and fishing opportunity, but there's areas to work. And so weekly check-ins with our co-managers is a recipe for success, so we understand each other. We also, we have a little bit different forecast this year. So these conversations are much easier when you have abundant runs. They just are. You carve this pie down to some really small number, and it gets difficult. The last thing I'll say, and you know this, Brian, without agreed to escapement goals, designing fisheries is really challenging. If you don't agree on the conservation target, it's tough to design a fishery. So we're thinking of ways we can have a long-term plan to develop those escapement objectives and a short-term plan to agree on fisheries that meet all of our, conservation goals. So all that said, post-season, we're happy with where we landed with a run size and escapement, but we fell extremely short in terms of a couple fisheries that we really wanted to offer. Thanks, Brian.
Our next hand is Patrick Gaffney. Patrick, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Thanks. Good to hear from you again, James. I just want to say very happy with this the work you guys are doing. It seems like it's getting sharper and sharper every year and a lot more transparent. So I appreciate that. I just am kind of curious in regards to the Chehalis. It seems like there's fish missing. It's always like that 1,000, 1,500 fish type of thing. So I'm curious, what was the Chehalis tribe's take last year to start with? And then I got a couple other things.
Yeah, so Mike's, got the numbers, but in this case, they're pretty easy. Is 0.
We 100% know it's 0.
Well, I mean, like I said, it's a relationship, and we got a lot of trust with our co-managers. We're hanging out with them a lot, Patrick, and there's not really benefit to them right now in implementing fisheries. And with a strong enforcement program, the Chehalis, implementing non-agreed to fisheries, potentially getting arrested for fishing illegally. So our understanding is 0 fish
Okay.
caught by
Cool.
the Chehalis tribe. And yeah, we're really confident in that number. So
Cool. Okay. That's good. And then I was just kind of curious what our impact rate was on we had a limited salmon season in December last year. So I was just kind of curious on what our impacts were. But just kind of following that up, I think it's, like you said, you want to use the best science available. And, I think, my position, I don't think removing the boats is using the best science available. And I think it's critical that we try to prosecute a full-fledged December salmon fishery nonetheless in the Chehalis Basin, including boats, so we can use the best science available to create a baseline and then go on from that instead of just kind of throwing darts, assuming that it's working. That would be my comment to your, you're wanting feedback on that.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm going to ask if Amy or Mike can help us understand the December fishery in the Chehalis. What do we know about impacts to steelhead last season?
Mike, do you want me to jump in on that one, or you want to go for it?
Well, you go right ahead.
At least for the creel survey, so we continued creel surveying in the areas that we were already monitoring. So mainstem, Chehalis, Satsep, and hump tulips during that time frame. During the 2 weeks of December that the fishery was open, we did not have any wild steelhead recorded in the creel. We had a few hatchery steelhead that were recorded in the hump tulips that were kept, but we didn't have any wild steelhead. We did have one wild steelhead recorded in the creel in the Satsep in November, but that was, mid-November. So management purposes, that one's not considered a winter steelhead at that point. But for this December fishery, we didn't have any recorded in the creel, at least.
Thank you. Well, I think it's important that we try to expand that baseline in December so we can slowly get back to fishing our regular seasons.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Amy.
Okay, our next question from the chat is from Luke. Luke, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
All right. So my internet's a little sketch, so I guess if it cuts out, you can read it. But thanks to everybody for all your work. I love to hear that we're on a positive trend. To me, though, it seems like we have been making a positive impact. However, we're still nowhere near where we should be, especially looking at historical data. We're essentially still struggling. So my question is, why are we considering changing anything? Especially, shouldn't we stay steady on course rather than spending the couple of bucks we put in the bank? I mean, we're still living in poverty. So why are we considering changing anything, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. So we're here to hear people's proposals. What I'm hearing from you, I don't want to characterize, I might be wrong, but what I'm hearing is that last year's seasons worked. So let's leave it that way. There's some people that feel like maybe they want to increase or decrease fishing opportunity for their own reason, but maybe some people want the same impact, but a totally different fishery. So maybe they'd like us to close in December so they can fish from a boat in January. So I think maybe there's just a diverse group of regulation options that people are discussing, and we want to make sure we don't miss them. So, but I think I was hearing, if it's not broke, don't fix it. That's kind of what I was hearing for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always for more conservation than less, but yeah, essentially.
Okay, thanks so much, Luke.
Our next hand is from Bob. Bob, go ahead.
Hey guys, hey team, thank you very much for all the information and all the charts and everything. It was really helpful, and I'm glad to see that in some places we're making some impacts. So my comments are more about the hoe and the quileute, looking at the numbers, looking at what we've had in the last couple of seasons. If I were to offer up some proposals, starting with the quileute system, we added boat fishing last year on the quileute from Maxfield down. and it looks like we still had plenty of room in our escapements and in our impacts there. So I would say, you know, I would ask that maybe we entertain the thought of moving the boating deadline up to the hatchery, still allowing the upper river to be no fishing from a boat. That opens up a little bit of access, spreads people out a little bit. I'd ask that we leave the Kalawa the same as last year, and also the Bogey Shield same as last year. 101 down on the Kalawa, Mill Creek down on the Bogey Shield. And then I would like you to, on the Quileute, maybe model what it would look like if we were to kind of, I know a lot of people really like that April fishery. So I would say, could we model what it would look like maybe if we allowed a couple of weeks into April on the sole duck? I probably wouldn't do it on the Bogey Shield or the Kalawa just because we're still trying to get numbers up there. But on the sole duck itself, it looks like we have some moon there to do that. And then, you know, I'd also emphasize that on the sole duck in April, you know, probably a good portion of those boats or people that would be in there would be targeting springers and not targeting steelhead. So I think we can kind of look at that a little bit. And then over on the Ho River, I'm glad to see that, you know, out of the last 7 years, we've been meeting our escapement, and it looks like it's been up a little bit. Obviously, we're doing what we're doing has been working. I would like to entertain possibly maybe a little bit of boat activity on the Ho, and I would say from Oxbow down. And being conservative, I would say Oxbow down January and February, knowing that the majority of the fish in the lower Ho are transient for that time of year. They're headed for the upper river, so leave the upper river to no fishing from a floating device. Allow us to fish out of a boat in January and February. And then I would go to no fishing from a boat in March for the whole river, knowing that the lower river, the fish are starting to hold, they're starting to be more stable. Our catch rates will go up a little bit. So maybe we don't do that and try to stay a little bit, give us a little bit, but stay a little conservation minded so we can continue to get that number going up. I don't know that there's enough room for an April fishery there at all, but maybe model it and just look at it to see if maybe we can go back to April 15th, you know, no fishing from a floating device in that time frame. That's that. And then I'm really hoping that you guys can come up with some good stuff for the Quinault and the Queets. I think those are super important, just because it does allow more opportunity and it does spread people out, which I think overall in the end is probably a good thing that we're getting more people spread out, because then our impacts will go down. So other than that, great job. Thank you very much. Hope you guys have a great night.
Hey, Bob, we're taking notes on all this, got all your proposals, really appreciate it. We'll dig into every single one of those. I'm hearing your Ho proposals, sort of this flipping from a boat to a not boat, different times of year. It makes me think about this idea of testing regulations, the no fishing out of a boat regulation, and putting that creel on top of it and seeing what we learn. So maybe you could keep thinking about that, talk with the people you talk with, and see if we can come up with some ideas to test that no fishing out of a boat rule and get really solid numbers to know what is it meaningful and how meaningful is it.
Yeah, we could definitely, I'll talk with a bunch of people and see if we can come up with some kind of plan to help facilitate that, because obviously we all want to know that and know that when we're making these regulations and we're making these things, that they're actually exactly intending to do what they're intended to do. So it would be great to know that. So yeah, we'll work on that. Thank you.
Thanks for all the feedback. Jenny, I want to make sure there's a chance, if there's something that came to mind there you just wanted to mention.
No, I was just taking good notes. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, everybody. Our next question in the chat, person that I was going to invite to ask live is from Christopher. Christopher, go ahead. Christopher, I just prompted you to unmute. Okay, we will go to the next hand. Our next hand is from Gabe. Gabe, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity and I appreciate you guys putting this together tonight. Try to go quick here so other people can have an opportunity to ask their questions. Uh, as far as fishery proposals, I think it's really important that we can access those coho and the chehalis in December. So, and from a boat, whatever we got to do to make that happen. I think that should be a priority. And then also having some boat opportunity to access hatchery fish in the Satsep and the Wainuchi. We don't harvest those fish. We all know what the outcome is going to be of that if we spend a couple of years not getting after them. And then, bank fishery and the scoop and chuck, I think would be appropriate there as well. So. That's about it for fishery proposals. And then the other question I wanted to ask was, has the department had any conversations with the Quinault tribe as far as if they're open to fishing the chehalis this year and if they're open to us proposing fisheries in the chehalis this year?
Yeah, Gabe. Mike and I and Rob Allen here on this call, bigger group too. We've all been meeting regularly with the Quinault Indian Nation. Conversations are going great. Their relationship's fantastic. So that's good. I don't want to get hopes up because a lot of these chehalis fisheries are really dependent on monitoring. The Quinault Indian Nation, they've got about a 60-70% monitoring rate. So they're handling almost every steelhead they're catching. And that's a lot different than a fishery we would propose really anywhere on the coast. So the monitoring program is going to be the key to success. I know the Quinault Indian Nation would want to know that we're going to have a finger on the pulse with any fishery that we're monitoring, especially being like 1,500 fish below the escapement goal. So all that said, I'm feeling extremely confident that we can design a fishery. My concern is that we design a fishery and we learn a lot about the chehalis in December, that impacts were higher than we anticipated, and we're making changes in season and frustrating anglers. So we want to find that balance with our monitoring and a regulation that lasts the season, so we actually learn something that we can then build on in future years. So a lot of complexities, but man, we're putting in the hours, so I hope we get it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, our next question in the chat was from Mark. Mark, go ahead and here's your chance to ask it live.
Yeah, James and the team, thanks for this presentation, all the good data and the work that you guys are doing. I've got a proposal for trying to get at the challenge you have of shaping a fishery while still needing to monitor it. And it seems like one of the key data points is encountering a wild steelhead. So obviously it has to be released. So the creel checker is always going to ask about wild steelhead encounters. What about instituting a voluntary reporting tool, something online similar to what we do with deer and elk harvesting? Giving that a try. Have a 1 month fishery, whatever, one of the chehalis rivers. I would favor the Wainuchi, but see if we can get a voluntary angler participation to self-report on any wild steelhead encounters.
Thanks, Mark. I really like that idea. I think the avenue, and I'm excited, Kelly, kind of bigger picture for fish program, has something to add, but I think the linkage there would come from, we're pushing really hard for this electronic catch record card data system. And some days if it included released fish, that would be maybe a linkage to understanding the released fish. I could be wrong on this. I'm not saying it wouldn't work. I like the idea. The first thing comes to mind though, is on the chehalis with 214 wild fish impacts. It's extremely tight margin for a volunteer reporting system. I see it being extremely valuable in places where the margin of error is less. We implement a fishery and then postseason we get to learn about it. But but that's not necessarily true. So I appreciate the comment, and I'm going to regroup, with Amy, who's thinking big picture about Creole, and then each one of our teammates. So thanks. Kelly, anything to add on that?
Thanks, James. No, nothing to add other than our current effort is to I guess mimic the paper record with an electronic record. So the encounter piece is not currently part of that, but it is, we're hoping to build a tool that we can manipulate as we get additional authorities to do so, is a way to say that.
Thanks, Kelly.
Sorry about that. I have mistaken your mouse on the screen for mine, and I couldn't figure out why I couldn't get it to move, James. Our next hand is from Kyle. Kyle, go ahead.
Thanks everyone for all the work done to this point on all of this. So I have a fishery proposal, thoughts on creel monitoring, but also just a couple questions about these sport impact limits on the Chehalis tribs. Is it possible to reallocate the impacts between Chehalis tribs or months when that slide that this slide here, is it like if we were to say just focus on enabling anglers to catch those hatchery fish near hatchery racks, does that does that simplify things or add additional impacts?
It definitely simplifies things. I had some language, just so I don't make people dizzy, I won't go all the way back, but some language about the statewide steelhead management plan, sort of protecting this diversity across the watershed. And so what we're trying to think about here is not putting all of our impacts kind of disproportionately impacting one part of the run versus the other. So that's what this table reflects. The background behind that, I know folks are probably sick of graphs at this point, but there's this graph here that shows the timing that these reds sort of pop in these different systems. And what you see, like in March, all this blue, this is like Newaukum, Skookumchuck, a different part of the river than we see in June, Wainuchi, Johns River, Hoquiam. So the logic is if we go in there strong in December, January, we impact the early part of the run. Where were those fish destined to spawn? So our plan is if we can design a fishery, we want to be extremely confident, 200 fish on the board and a really low escapement. We want to be confident that we're not just like removing a part of the wild population by putting all the impacts in one part of the river.
Yeah, and I think that's important too. I guess I would also just add that, and I guess a proposal for, I think it's really important that that anglers can access the hatchery fish returning to those Chehalis tribs. And if does it simplify things to concentrate the area as deadline fisheries, last mile fisheries, like for example, the Skookumchuck, I'm imagining there's very limited spawning habitat in that last section, right? There's a dam right there. And looking at things like that to really limit impact to those wild fish while allowing anglers to get at the hatchery fish. Does that make creel monitoring easier, right? If it's just a very, sort of more concentrated location where folks are fishing.
It does. And that's, I think that's a great idea. Focus the fishery where the resources are there to creel it and where the impact's likely low. And so those hatchery directed fisheries, I think that's going to be key.
And is there something from the standpoint of having some kind of trusted anglers program for getting good data if we don't have money for test fishers in those spots, although that would be fantastic if we could do that, because test fishers could monitor and fish and engage that, but even having some criteria for like a
similar to the volunteer reporting. And it's a good idea whether we can apply it this year. I just want to check on my internet. Is it okay, Leah? Okay, I got a little message. Yeah, but they're good ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Kyle.
Our next question in the chat is from Nick. Nick, go ahead and ask it live if you'd like.
Hey, I just had a question about the populations of wild versus hatchery fish in a given tributary, and I was wondering if there is a point at which the population of wild fish might be so low that it's simply given up on, I guess, and in favor of those hatchery fish. And I was thinking specifically of the Skookumchuck, where the population of wild fish is so low and that sport impact on those wild fish is so low, but the hatchery numbers have been so high. At what point does that river maybe just become a haven for anglers? And it seems like, you know, if we've done the opposite of that, as some rivers are designated as wild gene banks, why not do the opposite thing to benefit the anglers looking for those hatchery fish?
Yeah, and thanks, Nick, for the feedback. You're not the first one to bring up that idea. Is what are we trying to recover in a place like Skookumchuck? Currently in our statewide steelhead management plan and steelhead management policy, we don't have, I use your words, but I actually use the same word, is that give up approach. You know, can we pick select watersheds to focus them around hatchery production and fisheries and focus our recovery efforts on other systems? So appreciate the proposal, and yeah, you're not the first one to suggest that. So thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Our next hand is from Myers. Go ahead. I just prompted you to unmute.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep, we got you.
Okay. First off, thank you for choosing me. Second off, thank you guys for the hard work on getting all this data together. Super helpful. I think from the fishing I do out on the Olympic Peninsula, the Hoe, Sole Duck, Bogus Shield, those rivers, I think your data is pretty accurate. I think I would like to comment that this year, the Hoe was probably the best fishery I've ever seen in 15 years, maybe 10 to 15 years. There were more large fish than I've ever seen. There were more teenage fish than I've ever seen. And there were more females than I've ever seen in the system across the Hoe, the Sole Duck, and the Bogus Shield this year. So I just wanted to give you that data. I fished 28 days and 90 days out there. So I put in a lot of time. So if that's helpful, I would second then everything Bob Kratzler was noting and some of his thoughts there on in a boat, out of a boat, and on those rivers where I think it is possible. And I would like to see some of that on the Hoe, because again, the Hoe is, in my opinion, in great shape, continues to be in great shape. And I think the people, for the most part, who fish it, do a good job of keeping it that way, including you guys. Next, I'd like to also say thank you very much for in-season monitoring. I brought that up a couple of years ago as well. I thought that was a great idea. I pushed you guys, and I think the fact you guys are trying to implement that is fantastic. And I hope for the best there on the Hoe minimum, and then maybe on some of the other rivers as well. Question then is, you know, my concern about the Queets and the Quinault really centers around kind of your point about trust. You know, there's this thing called trust, and then there's this thing called trust and verify. I also do a lot of fishing with the tribe on those river systems, and I can tell you the increase in the number of tribe guides in the last 7 or 8 years is directly correlated with your decline, no offense, in what I'm noticing right in the numbers. I go on those trips, I'm with them, and they, no offense, they want to kill everything we catch, no matter what it is.
Yeah,
on the
hey,
lower...
Mark, I'm going to interrupt you there because I just want to be really clear. Trust with our co-managers is definitely not the issue today. there could have
No,
been.
and that's what you were saying, right? I think
I
verify
just
would be
I just
good.
want to make it extremely clear. I did hear you say that's what I was saying, but I just want to make it really clear. Not want to argue with you. Let's not spend any time doing that. But the trust with the
No, good.
co-managers is extremely high. The agreements on policy and management, not always there, and that's, I think, normal in a relationship. But trust is really high. Catch accounting is extremely high, and the level of precision around their catch estimates are the highest you're going to see in any steelhead fishery across the range. So just want
Is
to be
that
clear.
just with is that just with nets, or would you call that sport fishery as well?
Yeah, both. So I do appreciate
Sure.
your.
And I'll disagree with you on the sport fishery side, and maybe on the netting side, right? I can agree with you.
So hey, I'm gonna ask. I appreciate. Yeah, let's disagree on that. That's totally fine. But I'm gonna ask if you got any other proposals. Let's make sure there's time for other folks.
No, okay. No, loud and clear. Fair enough, dude. Thanks.
Hey, I appreciate it.
Our next question in the chat is from Luis. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
So we have the highest number of fishermen on the Hoe and the highest interactions with fish. I don't agree with Krotzer on this, on opening the Hoe to boat fishing, just because of the level of fishermen that choose to fish that river. I just see the impacts going way too high in a rapid fashion.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for that. Just a little bit of follow up. So the season last year would be more suitable, you think, for you?
Yeah, I mean, I love the gear fish. I love the fly fish. I would love to see more fisheries open to fishing with boats. I just don't see that river being able to handle that amount of pressure and foresee a full season.
Thanks for that. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Luis. Our next hand is from Ty. Ty, go ahead.
Hi, guys. I want to thank you guys all for presenting all this information. And I'd like to reinforce Kratzer's comments and his insight on these fisheries. I do have some questions, though, about the creel and the numbers of fish caught. And I don't doubt that the creel itself in the interviews are correct, but I guess my question is, how accurately do you how accurate do you think the creel is related to your red counts? And before you answer that question, I guess other agencies like Oregon have looked at this, and their red counts they've found are really more dependent on the conditions, and the creel obviously is dependent on the conditions. And so as an angler and as someone with a background in biology, I don't see us catching 9 out of 10 fish in a river. I see what I would have to guess what fish are caught multiple times and the conditions were really good. And there may have been more steelhead than the red count show. But I guess that's my question to you guys.
Yeah, Ty, thanks for the insight there. And I always appreciate you engaging in this stuff. So thanks so much. So a lot of pieces there, uncertainty around the creel. Amy's the expert in this room here. I just want to flag the comment you made about 86% of the run caught. I think you're right. And that may be that this slide should be edited for accuracy, because we know that there's an encounter rate and we compare that to run size. It could be that some fish were caught multiple times, and there's almost certainly a bunch of fish escaping the fishery completely. So that's a really good point, that it may not be 86% of the run size was caught, but it could be that not every fish, was caught. And I also want to mention, the numbers that we get, this 86%, there's a lot of uncertainty around it. So, you know, we'll have, like when we used to say in the hoe, the one other year we have solid data is 1.13. So every fish was caught 1.1 time. We had an upper bound that was 1.4. So every fish was caught 1.5 times, all the way down to this 0.8. So there's a lot of uncertainty around this point estimate that we've put here. So it could be greater or lower. And that's true. Amy, anything to add about the relationship with escapement and creel? Because you know more about this than me.
I mean, I guess I'd say I can speak from the creel perspective, since that's the part that I'm most heavily involved in. And you know, they are kind of two entirely different methods versus, you know, what the spawning ground escapement is and our confidence in that. So I can say for the creel, you know, it's definitely getting better. Like I help implement the creels, but I also do have a team of a couple other folks with me that can assist with the analysis. We're kind of working on trying to increase that. We kind of use what's kind of called this point estimate and some, you know, methods for calculating and expanding the effort and the catch currently, but we also kind of working on some ones that can provide us with some actual error bars and some confidence within those estimates, so we can kind of determine how confident we feel like we are in estimating catch and effort. So those are still kind of in the works a little bit, with being able to utilize those as readily as we can as the point estimate. But, you know, we do try and do a statistically balanced creel survey where we try and, you know, sample throughout the whole season and try and, you know, get as many interviews and get the effort as much as we can. So like I said, there's always room for improvement. And this has been a big step forward, I think, this year in just the creel estimates. And so hopefully we'll just continue improving in the future. So yeah, but for the relationship to spawning ground, I'm not an expert in the quite in how the spawning ground estimate is produced in those areas. So it might be, I can only kind of speak to the creel, at least at this point.
Hey Ty, thanks Amy, that's awesome, appreciate it. Ty, let's offline with Amy and the team, we should kind of have a think tank and we can show you how it's all calculated and you can give us kind of your thoughts on that and contribute. So thanks, Ty.
Thanks, guys. You guys have a good night.
Okay, and it's now 8 o'clock, so we want to be respectful of people's time. We'll take a few more questions. We still have quite a few hands though, and we can follow up. We have the comment portal online, and we can also follow up with email too. I think you have James's email and most of the staff's email. Our next hand is from Hal. Hal, go ahead. Sorry. There you go.
I'm representing the Steelhead Trout Club, and we agree with your methodology, and it's an impressive presentation, James. And you mentioned early on in the presentation that was a link below for extra sessions between now and November 27th. What our concern is that you've got all these proposals and the department's working on proposals for a reasonable fishery to protect the wild fish and have some meaningful harvest on hatchery fish. But between now and November 27th, there's no input unless we can do them in these extra sessions that are in that link that you mentioned, James. Is that correct? Can we join some other sessions?
Let me be really clear. We've got another town hall scheduled for the end of November.
Yeah, but that's the final decision.
Yeah, thanks, Al. I really appreciate you flagging this. So the other tools we're going to lean on between now and then are conversations, emails, phone calls. We have a web portal at that link where people can provide their comments. We've already had people using it over the last couple months, and we're getting some great proposals. Every single proposal we get that, you know, meets that criteria around diversity, distribution, those things, we're going to analyze them. So we're going to show up in November hopefully we will have had a whole bunch of conversations between then and now, and we're going to demonstrate those sort of modeling results and the decision in fisheries moving forward. So I hope folks don't wait till November to provide proposals, that, you know, the end of November at the town hall, because that will not be effective. Now's the time to start thinking about your fisheries and reaching out to us.
Okay.
And Hal, you know how to get a hold of me, and I know you know how
Oh
to get a
yeah,
hold of my friends
yeah.
here.
We'll
So,
probably be calling you. And
great. Thank you.
On the issue of boats, there's certain places where you don't need boats, like the Skookumchuck. If you had a terminal fishery on the hump tulip site, such as from Hanson Road to the Bluffs or something, just around the hatchery, that could be handled by bank. Whereas on the Wainuchi and Satsup and Chehalis, you just about got to fish out of a boat if you're going to fish at all. And that was brought up in the month of December. We should have it would be really almost mandatory to have boats allowed in December to fish for coal, and because of the previous testimony, no steelhead were caught, so that looks like a safe management plan. But on the Wainuchi and Satsup, there's an awful lot of private property you can't get to without a boat. And of course, you could float down with a boat and get out, but there's a lot of holes you can't even get out and fish. So we would favor leaning towards use of boats if that passes the criteria on impact.
Thanks, Hal.
Also, I guess, are we going to get to review any of the department's plans by email, by talking to individuals in the department that are developing them? Or are we going to just have to wait till November 27th when this is all done and cast in concrete?
So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to answer that question. And then Leah, I'm worried about people's time. If we can take one more question, we'll wrap up. But Hal's making a very good point. It's really important that people know to use the comment portal on the webpage if they would like to just submit proposals. And we're going to analyze all those. And then also, if people want to know the results of that work, feel free to put a comment in the portal, or everyone on this call is focused on coastal steelhead for the next 3 weeks, along with salmon management and all the other things folks do. But I just want to make sure everybody knows now is your chance to submit proposals, and these conversations are very important to us. That's how these regulations are made. And there's a group of folks how leaning into those conversations, and for some people it's daily. So this is our job. We want to hear from you guys. So let's move on to one more, Hal, if you're comfortable with that. And then we'll keep talking over the next 3 weeks.
Okay.
Thank you, Hal.
Thanks, Hal. Our last hand is Jesse. Jesse, go ahead.
Hello. I'll shorten it up since I'm the last guy. My question was about the diversity distribution. You brought up the Chehalis system and the Quileute. Chehalis system had 15 tributaries, where the Quileute had 4. I don't understand how we could compare the two. The Chehalis has a few main stems that seem stable in this color review, where I would like to see that, where the percentage of people fishing on those main stems of the Chehalis, that's the majority. I don't know many people that fish a lot of the very small tribs. So I'm trying to compute that in my head, because like our first guy, Mac, I'm kind of a data person and I like to see that.
Yep. Thanks for that. So Jesse, I don't know if we've chatted offline here, but I'm interested if you got time to put that in writing too, because I think what you're saying is important, but kind of complex. So I want to make sure we get it right.
Yeah, I didn't mean it to be the last question. I apologize.
It's great. No, I want to hear it. We all want to hear it. And I think it might be out of the box from where we're at now. So I want to make sure we don't miss that one. And then just highlight this graph's not comparing necessarily comparing rivers. We're really interested in the way this line bounces around within a system. If you know the Quileute well, you know you could break this up by a lot more. But our spawning ground surveys, this is a really convenient way to break it. And we get a lot of questions about how's it going in the sole duck versus the bogus shield. So we could look deeper into this next year, Jesse, or in the meantime, if you'd like.
I appreciate it, and thanks for the input, and thanks for the open forum.
Thanks all. One last plug for the comment portal. This is going to be an important tool if you're not the kind of person, you know, that has the time midday to give us a call and let us know what you think. So please use that and reach out to me if you can't find the link.